Hi, my name is Neil Doshi, and this is my IST 4.2 final presentation, Finance and Crowdsourcing Spring 2020. When the class started, I didn't know how I could embed crowdsourcing into my project. But, being a finance major, I did witness some big changes that have happened in the world, especially in the field of finance in the last couple of years. Post the Great Recession of 2008, I pretty much figured out that the corporate greed on Wall Street ruined everyone, right from the local vendors to local businesses to even Fortune 500 companies and to even themselves. And, they all ruined everyone and money was nowhere to be found. But, having said that, what really triggered me was that they were bailed out using taxpayers' money, and the smaller regional commercial banks that had nothing to do with it just went bankrupt and everyone had nothing to do but lose money. I knew that, something needed to be done in order to reduce this pompous culture. And, once I took this class, I realized that, if I could figure out what a lot of people think about both of these banks, I could find a lot of ways that I could help a smaller bank ultimately understand what big bank is and help them become a big bank. So I decided to do this project mainly to reduce that system in order to prevent such situations without the help of our legal system. Mainly because most of the things legal system did had already sort of been abided into the game and have already been priced into the markets. But still, we can see that there's so many factors and so many things that have been happening in finance that these big banks are in fault, but they don't do anything. So I wanted to create some survey, get some market information, and get some relevant points to provide to these small banks so they can directly implement unique strategies to increase their signs. I believe that this findings would help everyone, the common man, the society, even the financial system, because finance is the only system where monopolies are legal and nobody ever questions them. So there's something to think about. So, obviously, when I started doing a bit more of research, I realized that, why not? So many people would have already done research into this. Then, when I started digging more into it, I realized that most researchers, PhDs, investment bankers, traders will collaborate to understand the dominant effect and understand how these financial systems have been dominated. But most of them sort of created the fact that these banks have a lot of legal things to abide and they need to follow them. Nobody ever thought that they can even find loopholes in the system, in the legal system, and eventually make money out of it. Because, no matter how many rules SEC changed, these banks still had trillions of dollars and they were all getting $1 million bonuses every year. So most of these reports never factored as to why there's such a huge gap between the number of small banks and big banks, and why that has pretty much remained the reality of finance. That if there's a big bank that has a couple trillion dollars, they're just going to get into aggressive policies, which will eventually help them, drive out smaller firm competition. But at the same time, it'll help them maintain their own balance, maintain market power, and ultimately make money in return from customers to offset the losses for driving out the competition. So that sort of took me to a ride because that was some extremely pompous culture, and that was a culture that nobody ever even thought of questioning. So I thought that, if I sort of get some facts and logistics from these small banks, somehow somehow implement them into, a bigger picture, somehow understand how these small banks can understand these big banks, markets can change forever, and the financial system can be much more safer than before. So I started doing a bit of my own research. I thought that, I could use MTurk and some other crowdsourcing websites, some Google Docs, some more understanding to understand how I can improve this project. So to sort of get down to the scope, I wanted to use this project to understand on a concrete level what factors sort of undermine the growth of, of each of these banks, and how, if they are put together, can help a small bank make money. Therefore, I decided that this scope cannot sort of be limited to anything. So I wanted to split the research into two parts. And ultimately, I wanted to get data and some concrete data which can really get down to the narrow and the most limited parts for a smaller bank because there are so many big things that happen in the big bank and so many big things that a big bank can do that smaller banks cannot. So I decided that the method for me to do that would be to create a large survey, use different key metrics to rate the big banks and the small banks, both qualitatively and quantitatively, by asking some ratings questions out of 10, and also by asking some open-ended questions. With this help, I understood that I can get some really key statistics into what the people think about these banks. But at the same time, I will also get some personal opinions, some reasons why people have chosen to go to big bank, why they've chosen to go to a smaller bank, and what they think about the opposite. And then ultimately find a whole cross data set to find the positives and the negatives of small banks and big banks, and understand how these smaller banks can ignore the negative parts they have the positive parts they have, ignore the negative parts of the bigger banks, but ultimately somehow try to figure out the big banks' positives and ultimately combine both of them into a proper business model. However, as this is such a huge topic, I wanted to split the research into two parts. The first part being where the data is collected from the common people, from society, from workers, laborers, unions, everybody who is not directly working in finance but at the same time interacts with finance every day because everybody needs money, everybody has a bank account, credit cards, everybody needs to go to bank one week or the other. So they all also have some experience, and understanding what they do and understanding what they want to do can really sort of help us get down to the narrow part. The second part was where I wanted to collect some data from people who work in finance because they sort of understand the more knit and grit of the business, to understand more ways where these big banks have been making money, to understand more ways how smaller banks can become big banks, and give their opinions on both and have a much more detailed approach than what a common man would. So then I did a bit of my own work. I also got some results, and I started doing my own survey. So, at the first part of the survey, um, I, I, first part of the survey, I sort of split the whole research into five parts, and I started investigating common people. Most of them sort of thought that big banks had better services, were more financially engaged, but at the same time, they weren't comfortable and they weren't ethical. And I think that was sort of the much bigger advantage that small banks had. All of these ratings are out of 10, and approximately 100 people were, surveyed. A lot of them were customers, local firms, Fortune 500 companies. And I came down to these numbers by taking an average of the mean, median, and mode of the data collected from the survey. A lot of them sort of got some discomfort by having a big bang, but they also concerned that the financial implications that come with it are extremely bad. A lot of them also expressed some concern that even smaller banks have a lot more friendlier environment. They tend to lack the financial knowledge and often talk about everything but finances. In simple words, they believe that smaller and regional banks are where they want to account with, but they believe that these firms don't understand the banking industry and cannot be trusted. The second part of my data analysis came from the finance industry, where I collected most data points from understanding optimal capital structures, financial innovation, marketing, cap markets, and workflows. Again, sort of most of them thought that small banks had a better workforce culture and a more, family environment, but the big banks were just better in finance. And, almost 60 people agreed to that. Sort of going back to a much more qualitative aspect, they understood that small banks are sort of extremely financially weak and they sort of only, have services that are outdated and highly risky. They also don't have modern securities and modern access to work. So people really care for each other and maintain good relations, but they don't have the incentive to go beyond what is needed. In simple words, they just don't work as hard as folks on Wall Street. So best recommendations: change the workflows immediately, get new blood, modernize the office, get a more consumer focused model, and get a strong reaction from the local committee, make the best out of it, and then start aggressively marketing yourselves. Growth will inevitably follow. I think if these banks do these steps that I just mentioned, this is not me saying, this is everybody else saying, the society saying, I think they will become big and the financial system will get regular and get as good as it was before. Sort of going back to the whole project, I think there were a lot of things to reflect, and most important, what I think was, these factors are sort of easier said than done, and they can be implemented in some way or the other. But what really needs to happen is for people to understand the implications of the changes on Wall Street. Once we understand once we understand the dominance of the big markets, we ourselves will choose smaller banks and we will want to go work there and help them become big. Once that happens, once smaller banks become big, I believe that the world will never see a recession like 2008.